Our next speaker, James K. Hoffmeier, who's the Emeritus Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at Trinity International University's Divinity School. He was actually born and raised in Egypt. His passion for archaeology began, obviously, when he was a young person, which led him to a major in Near Eastern Archaeology at Wheaton College in Illinois. Graduate school took him to the University of Toronto, just like our previous speaker, where he earned his master's and PhD in Egyptology and worked on the Akhenaten Temple project excavations at East Karnak. From 1980 to 99, he was on the faculty of Wheaton College and then taught also at Trinity. He directed the North Sinai Archaeological Project from 1994 to 2008, which included excavations at Tel El Borg and paleoenvironmental research northeastern Sinai. 2 volumes of final reports have appeared for Tel El Borg. He is also the author of Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism, published by Oxford in 2015. And more recently, The Prophets of Israel, Walking Ancient Paths, 2021. He has authored and edited 20 books, written more than 100 articles in journals, books, dictionaries, and encyclopedias. He now lives in Paradise, Pennsylvania, an appropriate place for somebody coming to the end of his career. He's close there to his 5 grandchildren with whom he enjoys regular visits. I would say, pardon me? Okay. I would say that Hoffmeier is the authority on the relationship between Egypt and the Bible, including evidence for the authenticity of the Exodus tradition. So we're pleased that he's here today to present the topic, Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism. Jim.
Well, thank you so much. It's been 10 years since I was here last to speak, and I thought maybe I had offended somebody. And if you wait another 10 years, it might be too late. So just keep that in mind. We're all familiar with what Howard Carter said when he peered into Tutankhamun's tomb and broke through the bricks. But rarely does anybody note what Tutankhamun said back to him. Do you know what Tutankhamun said? He said, "Toot and come in." Okay. Falsely reported. Anyway, well, my session today will be focusing more on Tutankhamun's father, and tomorrow afternoon in my presentation we'll talk a little bit more about Tutankhamun and the surprising appearance he makes in history in North Sinai, where I was excavating between 2000 and 2009. So today, let me see, get used to these buttons. Yes, as mentioned in the introduction, the presentation I make today really is a slice of, or an attempt to put together a synopsis of my book, which is called Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism. Because I'm at a confessional school, I thought I'd throw in Moses too, make you all feel good about that. The big question, which has plagued scholars for many, many years now, is, was Akhenaten a monotheist? And this is an ongoing debate. I don't think we're settled, but I'm happy to present my case for it. And my case is that Akhenaten was a monotheist. Now, I need to clarify what I mean by that. Okay, there we go. Monotheism, as I define it, and that's not just my definition, is the exclusive worship of one deity and denying the existence of others. And that's really quite critical, that last part, denying the existence of others. If you're familiar with the Islamic creed, La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadur Rasulullah. There is no God but God, or no God but Allah. Okay, and so monotheism, it has that negative dimension to it that denies the existence of others. And the other thing we have to think about is that Akhenatism, which is what I would call the theological development that came from Akhenaten's religion, is something that actually did not happen overnight. It developed over a period that we can track in the actual text, a 5 to 7 year period of time until it reached its full maturation as a system of thinking. And by the way, I don't think, Akhenaten died at such a young man, probably in his late 30s, early 40s. And I don't think he had worked through everything yet. And that becomes clear, especially when we get to his burial and see his sarcophagus, where he was unable to break away from some of the funerary traditions that we know about. Okay, so is there a connection to Moses? Sigmund Freud wrote a book back in 1939 called Moses and Akhenaten, and he makes the rather startling conclusion, although maybe that's what I need to have a direct site. Can't hide behind here. That's it. Freud says, I venture now to draw the following conclusions. If Moses was an Egyptian and he transmitted to the Jews his own religion, then it was that of Akhenaten, the Aten religion. I'm sure Freud was not the first, and he certainly has not been the last, who have tried to make a connection between Atenism and Mosaic monotheism. Now, just to set Akhenaten in his place in history, in terms of the chronology of the 18th dynasty, very quickly, the dynasty was founded by Ahmose from 1540 to about 1525, following the lower chronology of Kenneth Kitchen. And what followed, of course, was a series of empire-building pharaohs. These empire-building pharaohs we'll hear a little bit more about tomorrow in connection with Akhenaten. His father, Ammonhotep III, ruled over Egypt at sort of the peak of its empire in a period of time some have called a Pax Aegyptiaca. This was a period of peace and tranquility. There was no war. Akhenaten was sitting at home writing poetry and chewing who knows what that gave him loopy ideas. And so on. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, because some believe that this affected his foreign policy, that this affected Egypt's empire and what on outside of Egypt. Okay, so the dates on Akhenaten then are about 1357 to 1337, 1336. And then we have Akhenaten's successors, more of whom we'll hear tomorrow, but of course in that mix would be Tutankhamun. Okay, so here's a map of Egypt, as we all need to recognize where we are in the world. And here is Heliopolis. That'll prove very important for the origins of solar religion in Egypt. Here is Amarna, or Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten. And way down here is Thebes. And all three of these places will figure prominently in the talk today. Now, at the time Akhenaten came to the throne, the undisputed great king of the gods was Amun-Re, a coalescence of Amun, the sky god of Heliopolis, the hidden one, as his name means, and Re, the sun god of Heliopolis. I refer to this as sort of the greatest corporate merger of all time, when these two deities are fused together for probably as much political reasons as religious reasons, but this proved to be a very effective and a very powerful deity. And certainly the priesthood of Amun-Re at Karnak, and Karnak Temple is the largest temple to survive from ancient times, was built to honor this deity. One of the earliest, and this is a rather small chapel, of Senwosret I, the so-called White Chapel at Karnak, was to this deity back early in the second millennium BC. Other smaller chapels like this one built by Hatshepsut, which housed the sacred boat or bark associated with the god, the Chapelle Rouge, the Red Chapel, and those who have visited Egypt have surely gone to Karnak and visited the immense pillars and ruins of this great temple. So who is Akhenaten other than a weird-looking guy? He is the son, of course, of Ammonhotep III, who we've mentioned already, and his mother was the great Queen T, both very strong and influential rulers. We also know that Akhenaten by birth was named Ammonhotep. Hence, he is called Ammonhotep IV. That was his name when he became king. But he had an older brother named Thutmosis. And Thutmosis, had he come to the throne, would have been Thutmosis V. But he died as a youth, and here we see him standing behind his father, making offerings as a young lad. And on his funeral bier, he is shown with a sidelock associated both with princes and younger folk in royalty. And so he must have died in his childhood or early teens. When Ammonhotep III finally died and his son came to the throne, it was Ammonhotep IV. And here we see one of the very early presentations of this king in the tomb of Keroueth, an official who actually was one of the organizers of the Hebsed, or the Jubilee Festival of Ammonhotep III. And if you look at him artistically, he looks pretty much cookie cutter like his dad. In fact, the artistic connections are very strong. Even one of the great pylons, the fourth pylon, originally had a head smiting scene of Ammonhotep IV, and it's now available to see in the so-called open-air museum that most people visiting Karnak don't go see. I recommend you go see it. All the little chapels I just showed you are in that area, but most tourists go in and out and miss what I think is some of the coolest stuff there. Here we have one of the very earliest, another early presentation. This is in the tomb of Keroueth, yes. And here you see on the left where Ammonhotep III is bringing an offering, and he's presenting it to Ra-Harakti. Ra-Harakti is a falcon-headed god, and you see the very large sun disk on his head. Ra-Harakti is a fusion of Horus's name and Ahti, the horizon, Horus of the horizon. And standing behind him is his mother, the Queen T. When you see typically in the art a king making a presentation and mommy is standing behind him, usually indicates he's not quite of full maturation, and the Queen Mother has a very important role to play in what's going on. On the other side, on the right side, you see Akhenaten, or I should say Ammonhotep IV, making an incense offering, and the deity seated on the throne is Atum, the sun god of Heliopolis. And once again, you have Queen T standing behind him. So this is interesting. One of the first scenes we have of this king, he is shown in very traditional pose, looking very much like his dad, making offerings to two traditional deities who will figure prominently in his early religious experience. So Ra-Harakti and Atum. Now, yeah, and there you can just, I've just marked off the names, which you probably can't see where you are because I can barely see them where I am. But there you have the names of those two deities. Well known is his wife, Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one is come or has come. And she appears very early in his life, but not apparently on those first scenes. As we know later on, she is ubiquitous in the scenes of Akhenaten making offerings. She's standing right there with him. And in one of his earliest temples, she is shown exclusively making offerings without the king, as if to show her as a very powerful person even early in his reign. Akhenaten, of course, is known for his worship of the sun, and again, throughout his presentations in the art, we see him adoring the sun disk, and there you see Nefertiti standing behind him and two of his eldest daughters, and this is the border Stila at Gebel el Barkal, opposite Amarna, about 5 miles from where I grew up as a kid, and we used to go there and have picnics. Yeah, just to show you the ubiquity of the sun disk in almost every scene of the royal family, and because he is portrayed in such unusual ways, we don't often see, and in fact, I can't think of any, where you have a king of the New Kingdom, the Empire period, fondling his daughters, crawling on laps, and so on. So we have an unusual scene sort of into the private chambers of the royal family, not so much the public ceremonies. The role of the sun god prior to Akhenaten, of course, was very important, as we saw in our last presentation, our first presentation, about the pyramids. The pyramids are very much connected to the solar cult of Heliopolis, or the city of On of Egyptian text, Yunu of the Old Testament. You remember that Joseph married the daughter of the priest of On, the priest of Heliopolis. It's translated in the Septuagint. And yes, the temple where the sun god was worshipped in Heliopolis was called Hut Benben, the mansion or the dwelling of the Benben. The Benben is this pyramidion that was the symbol of the sun god, and that's why it's so much connected to the pyramids that we heard about in our last presentation. So, and I'm sorry, I'm having to turn because I can't see my monitor there. So the sun god, Re Atum, as he's sometimes called, he's both called Re, which is sort of a generic term, and Aten is more of a personal name, had been a vital god in Egyptian religion going well back into the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age and beyond. And starting in the 5th dynasty, all the kings adopted the title Son of Re, where the king is actually the incarnation of the sun god. And the pyramids, of course, are definitely solar symbols, as is the Sphinx. We've had enough about that today. In the 5th dynasty, the kings between 2400 and 2300, roughly speaking, made large sun temples. These are located largely between Saqqara and Giza, if you're familiar with that, the Saqqara pyramid, the step pyramid, and the great pyramids of Giza. Most of these are completely destroyed now, but it seems that they are something of the architectural prototype to the later temples that Akhenaten built. So the Aten is a deity that some people recognize as there's something new about Aten in the period of Tutankhamun, but he wasn't new. In fact, Aten seems to be initially more of a generic term for the sun disk. And the sun disk is the vehicle of revelation and manifestation of the sun god. Okay? And that's why the iconography always shows you the sun disk. So here is a poem about the king Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty. And of him it is said, he is beheld like Re when he rises, like the shining of Aten, like the appearing of Khepri, that's the scarab beetle, another solar image, at the sight of his rays on high, like Atum in the eastern sky. So you see this collocation of deities, perhaps representing various aspects of the sun or the during different times of the day, because it starts like the rising and ends up with the eastern and the eastern sky, etc. So here you see these words all together, and notice that Aten, early in the 18th dynasty, is among the words almost, shall we say, synonymous with the sun god. In fact, you could actually go back and you find Aten's name in the Middle Kingdom as well, but we won't get into that. There is a growing interest in the sun god, and we can see this starting probably as early as Thutmose IV, the grandfather of Akhenaten, and Larry Berman, an Egyptologist known to some in this room, writes that Thutmose IV's reign, 1400 to 1390, increasingly emphasized that the king's identification with the gods, particularly the sun god, thus presaging one of the principal aspects of Ammonhotep III's reign. So with Akhenaten, with Thutmose IV, and then Ammonhotep III, father-son, and then it really got out of hand with Ammonhotep IV, Akhenaten. And certainly during the reign of Ammonhotep III, there is a growing interest, and in the Aten in particular. In fact, Ammonhotep III was very much enamored by the Aten, and he called himself the dazzling Aten. He called his boat, the equivalent of Air Force One, now Yacht One, was called Ammonhotep the dazzling Aten, and his palace was called, again, dazzling Aten, Tehen Aten. Okay, there's the name of his solar bark. Sorry, I got that out of order. The name is dazzling again. So clearly, under Ammonhotep III, there is an increased usage and interest in Aten. And some people think, well, this was just a logical progression. It's an evolution. Solar interests were always there. They got a little bit bigger under Thutmose IV, even more with Ammonhotep III, and then go completely nuts with Akhenaten. And there is certainly something to that. This is the outside of the tomb of Ramosa. And Ramosa's tomb is rather marvelous because you can see the transition from the high quality of art from the period of Ammonhotep III, as you can see in this relief of two of the children of Ramosa, who was the prime minister or the vizier of Upper Egypt. But in this tomb, we can see, and I'll just go right to the line drawing because it's a little bit clearer. We go from the art of Ammonhotep III, and very quickly, probably by year 3 or year 4 of the king's reign, we find some of the iconography starting to change. We're starting to see the sun disk. We see some of the epithets of Akhenaten. The name of Akhenaten has changed, and the name of the Aten, his god, has also changed. Now, I'm going to take it back a step further in the iconography. Here you can see some of the iconography of Ra-Harakti, who we saw earlier on that original relief from the tomb of Keroueth, where the king is making an offering to Ra-Harakti. And you can see the sun disk there in the sky with the snakes hanging, the Uraeus snakes hanging around the sun disk, and around their necks are keys of life. Now, all of that we bring into the iconography of Akhenaten as it develops. And I want you to realize that, at least from my perspective, the developments in the iconography of Akhenaten reflect developments in his theology. Now, if I could step back a second and use the analogy, what I'm going to suggest is that Akhenaten had some sort of theophany. That is, he experienced something that he perceived to be some sort of divine manifestation. Let's call it a Damascus Road experience. Something like that. And we all know from the biblical story about St. Paul that he was on the road to Damascus. He was struck by this light that changed his life. But we know, if you read on in the book of Acts, that he had to be taught something of the Christian faith that he had just been exposed to. And it took a while for Paul's theology to develop as he learned more and more. And I think this is true with Akhenaten, in that he had an experience, and we're going to see how over a period of, as I said, 3 to 5, 6, 7 years, we see changes. So at Karnak, right in the sanctity of sanctities in Karnak Temple, what do we have? Akhenaten starting building temples to the Aten. That was probably seen as rather rude by the powers that be, but nevertheless he did. We know he built a number of temples, none of which are standing today, because when he died, they were all dismantled, and the ever environmentally conscious Egyptians recycled them. They reused them. We'll show you more about that in a moment. But here's a block that's in the Berlin Museum, and you can see the name of the Aten, and we call him the Aten, but Aten really is a very abbreviated form of the name. So what we see in these two lines, the name is Ra-Harakti, who is shown there, remember, with the big sun disk on his head, who rejoices in the horizon in his name of Shu, who is in the Aten. So here you have Ra-Harakti, a solar god. He's falcon-headed, human figure, sun disk on his head. Shu could be rendered as simply the word for light, the old let there be light idea, although Shu was also a deity, one of the earliest created from the sun god. When the sun god begins his creation, as presented to us in the pyramid texts that go back to 2500 BC and earlier, we find the importance of this god, Shu. We see it again, okay, hopefully, yeah, you can see here in yellow on the right, there is a sun disk, there are the Uraeus cobras with the Ankh signs hanging around their necks. So you can see that iconography is now being brought into as his develops. And you can see the figure of the king on the right where he still looks like an 18th dynasty king, not the weird figure we've come to all know and love. This is a block that was found many, many years ago in the 1800s at Karnak. Nobody knows where it is. Fortunately, somebody made a drawing of it, and all we have is a drawing of it. But here you can see a very early block of one of the earliest temples he made, and there on the left you have the name of Ra-Harakti, who rejoices in the horizon. And the next line, the next line here has the name of Shu, that same word I just mentioned a moment, and here is Shu depicted. So clearly he was associating the Aten with this primeval god, Shu, who is the atmospheric air. And we have also, we have on the right the consort or wife of Shu named Tefnut. And so here they are both depicted. So it's very clear he wasn't a monotheist at the beginning, but we're going to see how all these older elements will disappear very quickly. The ninth pylon, which is recognized by the crane standing beside it, if you go visit Karnak, it was in very bad state of disrepair many decades ago, and the French began taking it apart for fear it would collapse. And in so doing, they found that the internals of this were stuffed with these particular stone blocks called talatat. Talatat are 1 cubit long. We were talking about the cubit a little bit ago. And the cubit turns out to be metrically 52 centimeters long, 26 by 25 wide. And they're unique because they'd never been used by any king prior to Akhenaten. Akhenaten introduced them perhaps as a way to build temples faster. Instead of the great big blocks that have to be dragged and moved on sledges and so on, these man could just pick up. And we know that because we actually have a talatat. Well, let's leave that by. Oh, okay, I may have taken that out to shorten things. No, it's coming up. Okay, fortuitously I arrived at the University of Toronto in BC times compared to Kent here, when Donald Redford was one of my principal professors, and I worked with him on the Akhenaten Temple project, but I worked with him on his excavations in 1975 and 1977, and here you hear Don, and here's the talatat with men carrying talatats, showing the building of these temples. And you can see the one has it on the shoulder, the one's putting it down, and notice how carefully he keeps his fingers out. He didn't want to get his fingers underneath. Good idea. So this enabled the king to build temples very quickly. These are made out of sandstone from south of Luxor, a place called Gebel El Silsila, which is the beginning of where we start to get sandstone as compared to limestone. From Luxor north, everything is limestone. From halfway towards Aswan, the geology shifts and we get the Nubian sandstones. And here's a teletat, again, with the Sphinx. Now, notice the Sphinx in which Akhenaten's head is there, and he's adoring the sun. Again, the use of this solar image. Okay, so here you can see just many, many temple examples from temples of the sun disk. One of the weird things about this king is that he celebrated a Sed festival, a Jubilee festival, probably around year 3 or year 4, and he had to build a massive temple complex called Gem-pa-Aten. Gem-pa-Aten. I'll explain that more in a moment. But the Jubilee festival is normally celebrated, although not exclusively, but normally it's celebrated after the king has been on the throne for 30 years. It's a renewal, a revival of the kingship, et cetera, a king who is maybe by this time 20 years old. One doesn't expect a Jubilee. So what's going on here? And here scholars are all over the place, but you can see the king, well, there he is, same, a different one, where he wears this interesting garb, and this is the Hebsed garb, which goes all the way back to Dynasty 1. We have examples of kings wearing this outfit. So a great jubilee was celebrated, but several things happened at that time. Number one, the name Akhenaten begins to appear, and the name Ammonhotep disappears. So on the blocks, now you'll notice the colored block from Berlin must have been a year 1 inscription, where he's still called Ammonhotep. On the teletat blocks from Karnak, and there are at least 4 temples built there, various sizes. The largest was Gem-pa-Aten. So the name now appears to be Akhenaten, which means he who is serviceable to the Aten, Akhenaten. Not to be confused with his city, Akhenaten, which is the horizon of Aten. Sound very similar? They're not. But so we have this celebration of this festival. And one thing that was noticed by Redford and others is that we see 3 daughters presented here. In the end, he'll have at least 6. And so it's figured that this is probably taking place by year 4, because it seems that he was not married to Nefertiti until after he became king, and they would have had 3 daughters, rather quick succession. So, and 3 more are to come. And so it's believed, and those 3 are all together at Amarna by year 9 when he moves. So in any event, year 6 when he moves. Year 9 is another important year. But here you have 3 of the daughters being carried into this Jubilee festival. So number 1, we see his name changing. Now he's Akhenaten. So I think his Jubilee is sort of a transfer of the old king to the new king. He's no longer Ammonhotep, he's now Akhenaten. The other thing is that now Aten's name, he who rejoices in the horizon that we saw, now appears in a cartouche. Remember, Amun-Re was called the king of the gods, the superior god, the god of gods. Well, now Akhenaten is simply going to be that. Here's an artist's reconstruction of the Gem-pa-Aten, and we'll leave that and go on. So here we can see his new name in the famous statue of Akhenaten in the Louvre in Paris, where he's called Akhenaten there on the right. And you can see that the name of the deity now appears in cartouches, signaling his kingship. And wherever you see the name of the god written, his cartouches are much bigger than that of Akhenaten himself. So here you can have it, Ra-Harakti, who rejoices in the horizon, in his name of Shu, who is in the Aten. So here we are about year 3, year 4. If you go out to Karnak Temple, how many have been to Karnak Temple? All right, excellent. Okay, if you ever go again, walk through the first pylon, walk all the way back to the gate at the back, which is one of the Nectanebo gates from the 30th dynasty, and peer out through the gate and you'll see a trench that looks something like, well, you'll see it in the next slide. The famous statues of Akhenaten that are scattered in different museums, one's in the Louvre, several in Cairo Museum, Luxor Museum, they were found in this area. I wish this picture were better, but it was taken in 1977. We all know what happens to slides from the 1970s. But this was our team in 1977, Redford in the middle. That's me on the far right about 70 pounds ago. And so this is where our team was working. And here you can see the Nectanebo gate at the back. You can see the first pylon way in the background. And here's where we're digging. This trench through here, had been cut in 1922 by the French archaeologist Chevrier. And he is the one who actually found the first of those statues. He cleared out a line of piers where the statues had stood, and they were smashed and fallen all over where they had been bashed to bits. And then subsequent to that, the blocks from the temple walls were all taken and moved and reused, like in the 9th pylon, in the 10th pylon, and in the 2nd pylon. Okay. We were able to clear some of this in 1975 and 77, and you can see the piers that these were large square pillars, and the statues of the king stood against these. And that was interesting find, but the most important was we actually got to some places that Chevrier did not, and we actually found the corner of this temple wall. And Redford in 2003, or a little bit earlier, had found, and you see the Talatat blocks, these characteristic blocks. And there is, there is the corner, the opposite corner. So we had the one corner, now we have the other corner. In 2003, the nearby village was undergoing a water drainage project, and my friend, the late Ted Brock, was responsible for documenting the finds of the water department. This was not a dig, but they let him in and document, photograph, claim stuff. And of course, here they found beards from the statue, different fragments of the statue, granite altars, and so on. Now, here's where we are. So here's the Karnak Temple, here's the 10th pylon, there's the sacred lake, for those of you who've been there. This is the temple of Amun-Re, and then beside it, probably in this area, is where the temples of Akhenaten were built, and here is the great temple of Gempa-Aten. So we discovered this corner in 1977, some years later, the other corner. Now, and by the way, the excavations you saw on the previous slide were off this wall. So this is a huge, big open court where this Hebsed festival is celebrated, and there was more Akhenaten building material at East Karnak than any other king previous to him. It was huge. And the purpose, again, was for this Hebsed, and within a few years, he decided the heck with it, closed down the temples, and moved the operation to Amarna, where he again built temples. He also, probably about this time, engaged in a program of iconoclasm, destroying the images of Amun. You can see here, and this is on his father's temple at Luxor. So here's his dad, and here's Amun-Re all hacked out. How does the goddess survive? Well, she is associated with the sun god. She's the daughter of the sun god. Maybe that was a rationale for letting her survive. But even crawling to the top of obelisks, or maybe this was down at the time, but even the image of Amun-Re was hacked out here, his name was hacked out here, and then it was restored under Seti I around 1300 BC. And even out in our excavation in North Sinai at Tel el-Borg, we found these blocks with the name of Amun hacked out on them in the name of Ammonhotep II, who probably built our fort. So this program of desecration goes from Sinai all the way down south into what is today Sudan. And even here, the statue of his dad, Ammonhotep III, if you look on his belt, the name of Amun is hacked out of the belt. So even dad's name could not survive this purge. So I'm asking the question I've already told you the answer to, at least my theory. Did Akhenaten have a theophany, a divine encounter that motivated this revolution? One clue is the temple that I told you about that we were excavating back in the 1970s. It was called Gemet Pa'aten. And what's interesting is not only was that temple built in Karnak with that name, it was also replaced by another temple in Amarna. It was called Gemet Pa'aten. And we have in Nubia another temple called Gema'aten. Now, rarely do you find three temples basically with the same name. And the key to it is, what does Gem Pa'aten mean? It probably means something like, Gem means to find or discover. So it could be rendered, the Aten is discovered or found. And I think that's one clue that the biggest temple he made was called Gem Pa'aten. The Aten is found. In the 10th pylon, somewhere up in there is a block that's partially in view, and part of it's not. It's still there, Redford tells me. He climbed up and read the text, and it's the most interesting, tantalizing text. If I had $1 million, I would invest in the equipment to take this apart and find if there are other blocks connected with this. But these are architectural pieces that are before the size of the Talatat, the standard block. These are on a larger block. So this shows us probably year 1. He seemed to have built something in year 1, and then about year 3, he starts using these Talatat blocks. All right, and it says, lo, Harakti seated himself in his form, something or other, which is not known, some mysterious form of the god Harakti. And then the king, this is not a quotation now, the king responds with a decree to build a temple befitting this deity whose form is not known. And the text suggests that the gods had, and the word here is abab, ceased to function. And this seems to be suggesting, for whatever reason, that the gods aren't quite cutting it anymore. And Harakti appears to him and says, hey, you got to build a temple. And then Akhenaten states, and this is a quote, their temples had fallen into ruin. And this is a quote from Redford. So the quotations are actually from the text and the rest is him. So I'll just read it. The temples are fallen to ruin, and seems to imply that the old deities, and the plural necheru is used, gods, were ineffectual while elevating the presumed new Aten, who himself gave birth to himself, the self-created one. No one knows the mystery of where he goes and where he pleases. They know not his going. Mysterious God who comes and goes, etc. So this block is from about year 1, and it seems to provide the rationale for building the new temples to this new God who had revealed himself to the king. Okay, and we've mentioned already that he moved to Akhenaten to do this. On the boundary stela, over a dozen of which surround the greater Akhenaten city, there is another interesting text, again, which suggests theophany, divine appearance. Behold, Aten. This is a quote. Behold, Aten. The Aten wishes to have something made for him as a monument with eternal and everlasting name. Now, it is the Aten, my father, who advised me. This is important. So it's his father who told him. No official had ever advised me. He wasn't told by a priest. He wasn't told by an official to do this. It was Aten who told him directly. It is Aten, my father, who advised me concerning it, so that it could be made for him as Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten. So this is the second hint at some sort of theophany which prompted his actions, in this case to build a new city with more temples. Here's the great Akhenaten Temple, the plan of which is by Barry Kemp, who's the current excavator at Amarna. And all those little dots that you see, these are all altars. In all, there are about 2,000 altars connected with this. His preoccupation for altar making and offerings on those altars was obsessive, to say the least, and unique. And I want to, again, if you think of biblical examples, again and again, when a biblical character claims to have some sort of divine encounter, the response is to build an altar. Starting with Noah, who built an altar. When God appears to Abraham at different places, he builds an altar. And you can go through biblical stories. And so I think the human response to a divine encounter is to build altars. Again, I'm just suggesting that this is a perception. There's no way you can test it, but there you are. Okay, a further indication of how his theology had changed. By year 9, and here you see the cartouche of the god Aten. Now, look what it reads now. Living ray, no more Herakti, ruler of the horizon, rejoicing in the horizon in his name of Re, the Father who has come or who has appeared as the sun disk. Herakti's name is gone. The name of Shu is gone. No desire to communicate that other gods were involved in this god. He's stripped all this away. And when you see Akhenaten and the temples and so on, you never again see the kinds of deities in the art or in the names. Now, among the private citizens, yes, you will find amulets and other little deities, but not in the royal area. Now, for me, the hymns to the Aten are the final clincher to the argument. The hymns to Aten are magnificent. They're only found at Amarna. The main one, the great hymn, there are about 5 or 6 versions of a shorter hymn, but the great hymn is only in one tomb, the tomb of I. And it opens by saying that it came from the Sabayat, the instruction of Akhenaten himself. So this appears to be his genuine working out of his theology. And we're only going to look at a tiny bit of it. Let me just read a couple lines. Splendid you rise in heaven's light land, O living Aten, creator of life. Earth brightens when you dawn on the horizon, when you shine as Aten of daytime. How many are your deeds, though hidden from sight? O soul God, Wa, okay, soul, one, besides whom there is none. There's your exclusivistic statement. There is no God but Aten, and Akhenaten is his prophet. You made the earth as you wished, you alone, all peoples, herds, flocks, the lands of Hor, which is Syria, and Cush, which is Sudan, all the lands of Egypt. This is a universal God, not just a local God. So was it monotheistic? That's our starting question. Other deities, especially Amun-Re, are persecuted and eradicated and temples closed down, priesthood fired. If you want to join my movement, you have a job. If you don't, boom, see ya. The plural writing of the words Necheru no longer are found when you get to Amarna. And earlier writings of Necheru, plural, are scratched out. For instance, I see many cases of this at Deir el-Bahri. If you visit Deir el-Bahri, you can see the plural is carved out, but then recarved again. But you can always tell because it's concave where they erased it and then rewrote it. And new temples were built all over Egypt, at Karnak, at Akhenaten, at Asyut, at Memphis, Heliopolis, and Nubia, and possibly even in North Sinai. We'll touch on that tomorrow. So the exclusivistic element is really what is critical, I think, in separating monotheism from what historians of religion call henotheism. That is, you worship one God, but you don't necessarily deny the existence of others. Okay, so you can worship Aten, I'm going to worship Ammon, and so on, who all live happily ever after. Okay, is there a connection to Moses and the Exodus? Very quickly, I just want to say that there are, of course, chronological problems, depending on when you want to date the Exodus. Either traditional classical dates of the 13th century or the 15th century poses problems with Akhenaten falling in the middle. And I'll just try to summarize this quickly by pointing out that no copies of the hymn to Aten were ever found outside of Amarna itself. In other words, they did not survive, as far as we know, in any form. They only occur at Amarna on tombs. Obviously, they were on papyri. We don't have any. They haven't survived. The other thing, of course, is that Akhenaten is about 200 miles from the biblical land of Goshen. And if you read the Exodus narratives, it gives you the impression that Moses could wake up in the morning and very shortly be at the palace to talk to Pharaoh. Well, that's a 200-mile trek would not work if he's communing with Akhenaten. When he dies, there's his sarcophagus, his religion died with him. His family quickly changed their name. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. His daughter, Ankhes Ba'aten became Ankhes Amun, and so on and so forth. Aten was completely ripped out of the names of family members going forward. Now, lastly, what I'd like to say is that both according to the Egyptian literature and the biblical literature, I think each religion has its own theophany. Both are rooted in what was believed to be an encounter with deity, and that's what led to their religious systems. In the case of Akhenaten, he did not have disciples who followed him. His temples were torn down, everything was destroyed. So it's very hard to think that somehow this influenced the Hebrews, the chronological problems notwithstanding. Thank you very much.
Okay, question number one.
So, great presentation, and with the discussion of monotheism in ancient Egypt, I was wondering about in Genesis either 12 or 13, there's the story of the Pharaoh that the Lord appeared to and told him not to have relations with Abraham's wife. If you remember that that story.
I think you're thinking of Abimelech.
And I was wondering what were the beliefs at that time in ancient Egypt? And
What was the what?
What were the beliefs at that time in ancient Egypt? Was there some monotheism at that time as well? That would have been like maybe 2000 BC.
One of the great debates amongst historians of religion is whether polytheism is really the worship of many gods, or is it manifestations of the one? And so Eric Hornung wrote a famous book, The One and the Many, which is sort of a classic book of Egyptian religion. There are two schools of thought amongst those who study religion. So you have Jan Assmann, who wrote a book on Egyptian religion, and then Eric Hornung, two classic European scholars who take different positions on whether it's true polytheism or one as a reflection of the many. For instance, I remember, and I don't know much about Hinduism at all, but I remember years ago when I think it was Mrs. Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and her son, who succeeded her, I think became the prime minister, spoke on worldwide TV and appealed to God. And I had a student at the time who was an Indian. And I said to her, I said, how does he speak of God? You know, I thought there are many gods in Hinduism. And her answer was this very point. Well, there are those in Hinduism, some who believe that the gods are manifestations of the one. And you know, again, Egyptologist, we could ask Dr. Liska here what if she hears any of those different schools, but whether there's genuine polytheism or polytheism is an expression of the one expressed through the many. But so I would say there are two schools of thought out there, but the gods, I mean, Jeremiah said it perfectly, where he says, has a nation ever changed its gods? That usually doesn't happen. And that's what was so shocking. I was talking to somebody in the hallway, why the whole Akhenaten thing was rather shocking, because he's really, you can always add more, but to eliminate, that is another story.